bosses. If you ask any modern Don't Starve player, then they would tell you that they are an obstacle that you must overcome to progress through the game. In fact, most Don't Starve Together challenge runs end when the player defeats a certain boss, or bosses. But if we look at the older version of the game, Don't Starve single player, we will see that bosses used to be a threat that the player had to deal with, but not to progress further in the game. So, what happened? I'm Polarlotus of the Polarlotus YouTube channel, and today we're going to talk about that. To answer this question, we have to first analyze the evolution of Don't Starve as a whole. It all starts with Don't Starve Reign of Giants, which released almost 11 years ago in 2014. This DLC added many things that were missing from the base game that we are all familiar with today as Don't Starve Together players. Most specifically, seasons and giants. Then, just a mere 2 years later, Don't Starve Together released. And at first, this game was pretty much one-to-one with Reign of Giants, just with increased health of enemies. It was literally Reign of Giants with friends. But ever so slowly, update after update, Don't Starve Together split off from Reign of Giants, eventually becoming not only its own game rather than a standalone multiplayer expansion, but also becoming a sequel of sorts, thanks to the progression of the ever-evolving Don't Starve story that most of us are familiar with. Okay, games evolve, no big deal, right? So how did the design philosophy of bosses change so much that it's apparently worth me making an entire video about it? Well, let's head over to Reign of Giants to analyze Clay's original vision of how bosses should work. In the original Don't Starve, bosses are designed as dynamic, unpredictable threats that disrupt the player's routine. Giants such as Deerclops, Bearger, Moose Goose, and Dragonfly appear during specific seasons, usually near the end of the season, and then once they arrive at your base, they basically just give you a not very good time. But the key thing to note is that these bosses are not optional challenges, but existential dangers that demand immediate attention. The primary goal in Don't Starve, the single-player version not together, is pure survival. Boss encounters emphasize this by punishing complacency and testing the player's adaptability. 4 out of the 5 bosses of Reign of Giants, I'm not counting the tree guards by the way, those don't count as bosses to me, are considered seasonal bosses, meaning they will come to you instead of you going to them. Don't get me wrong, Don't Starve Together also has seasonal bosses, but 2 of them were changed to be far less punishing, while adding the countless other progression-based bosses. Funny enough, one of the most punishing seasonal giants, Dragonfly, was removed from the seasonal roster and instead replaced by a hormonal ant who just annoys you with holes from time to time. Regardless, these encounters are often characterized by avoidance rather than direct confrontation. Many players choose to lure bosses away from their bases or set up environmental traps rather than engaging in direct combat with single-player bosses. This reinforces the survivalist ethos of Don't Starve, where resource conservation and risk management are the purpose of the game. And fighting bosses is, well, an optional struggle that one can take on, but not one that's necessary to enjoy all of the content in the game. So, what about Don't Starve Together? Well, to start, let's look at the updates that pivoted Don't Starve Together away from its roots, the new Reign update line. What started as a beta line that just kept adding more and more content, the new Reign update line eventually fully finished and went live in 2017, just a year after Don't Starve Together's release. This added tons of content, but most notably, it changed the game as a whole boss-wise. It added a new, but much weaker summer seasonal boss to replace Dragonfly, Antlion, and then 4 new raid bosses. But wait, what is a raid boss? A raid boss in gaming refers to a particularly difficult boss encounter designed to be fought by a large group of players simultaneously, requiring coordinated teamwork and strategy to defeat, often offering significant rewards for overcoming the challenging fight. Essentially, the most challenging boss encounters within a game that necessitates a raid to take down. These raid bosses came in the form of Toadstool, Klaus, Bee Queen, and finally, one of the climactic bosses in the game, Ancient Fuel Weaver. But what do all of these bosses have in common? They pose absolutely no passive threat to the player. Toadstool isn't going to attack you randomly in the caves. You have to go to him. The same goes for every single other boss on this list. They don't pose any danger to the average Joe. They are more so meant to be gatekeepers to endgame content, or mid-game content, or whatever they drop. Bosses, once feared by the player base as unwelcome intrusions, are now viewed as valuable targets to conquer for progression, much like Terraria. You don't see bosses as threats, rather targets. You want to defeat the bosses. You're not scared of the bosses defeating you, if that makes sense. This is proven even more with the introduction of Rift content. Rift content is considered by most to be the true endgame of Don't Starve Together. And I may be alone here, but I actually kind of like rifts. They bring a sense of danger back to the player. When the surface rifts are open, it will cause much more dangerous bosses to actually hunt the player down, much like the old bosses. Lunar Deerclops, Lunar Bearger, and the Lunar Varg. The thing that keeps it different, however, is these bosses are still considered targets, not threats. You see, in order to even spawn these bosses, you must defeat their original forms. Then, and only then, do you start the fight with these new forms. So this means that the player is still not meant to treat this boss as a threat, but rather another target to defeat to get that sweet, sweet endgame content. Oh yeah, also surface rifts will make your plants spiky and hormonal sometimes too, which is, cool. I guess it's dangerous, but I don't know. There is also a rift variant in the caves. Now, these are even more formidable to anyone living in the caves, as once they are open, not only will mimics roam around copying tools to surprise you with, but also giant blobs of nightmare fuel will fall from the ceiling to suck you to death. Wait, did I read that right? So, rifts don't seem that bad, right? Well, remember how I said that bosses in Don't Starve Together are meant to be gatekeepers rather than threats? You guessed it. These rifts are not only locked behind multiple different bosses, but they are also locked behind the two endgame bosses. And that right there is the answer to the question. Bosses have gone from an existential threat in the old days of Don't Starve, aka single player, to merely a means- Whoa. But Lotus, how did the fundamental of bosses change? You said it yourself, the seasonal giants still exist, albeit 2 of them were nerfed, but just because they were nerfed doesn't mean they were removed. Yeah, I know, but here's the thing. Clay's vision of bosses has clearly changed a lot since they first were introduced, and some of it leaked over into the DLCs as well. In Shipwrecked, there is only one true seasonal boss, but I do give an honorable mention to Tiger Shark since she will hunt you down as well sometimes. And in Hamlet, there's only one event boss out of the 4 there. Not even a seasonal boss, just an event boss. These extra bosses became targets that you could hunt down on your own time for their extra loot. It wasn't just Don't Starve Together that shifted this way, although it extended dramatically in Don't Starve Together, with 2 true seasonal giants and 2 kind of optional giants, and then over 20 non-seasonal traditional bosses. You see, thanks to the fact that in Don't Starve Together you have to fight bosses to progress, they kind of lose their scary charm. Sure, a new player is going to get scared of their first Deerclops encounter, even in Don't Starve Together. It's a canon event. However, once they muster up the courage to fight literally any other boss, which again they have to in order to progress, Deerclops suddenly doesn't seem that scary with her low health pool and incredibly slow attack. And if a player plays Don't Starve Together long enough, they are destined to take on one of the traditional bosses eventually. Unlike in Reign of Giants, where the bosses not only just have a chance to show up, but they do not need to be defeated to progress whatsoever. Even the Ancient Guardian can be ignored entirely. Reign of Giants allows the player to live in perpetual fear and still flourish. And while that seems, on the surface, like poor game design, remember that Don't Starve was originally meant to be a true sandbox survival game with no true progression system. It was meant to be a test for players to see if they could overcome uncompromising odds and flourish despite the hostile nature of the world. Now, I've been talking about this like I hate this decision by Clay, but honestly, I kind of like it. In fact, I think giving a game a proper progression system can help it reach a wider audience, even if health tank bosses are at the center of that progression system. This is actually proven by the Steam player count charts, which has a shaky but noticeable uptrend. Part of that has to do with the fact that Don't Starve Together as a whole has actually gotten easier than its predecessor and far more compromising. Part of this had to do with seasonal changes. You see, in Reign of Giants, summer and winter were basically boss level threats of their own. For winter, trees burnt out quickly, thermals were weaker, and food was actually scarce as you couldn't grow any crops, and icebergs were hard set to drop only 3 ice per. For summer, caves don't nullify overheating, fire spreads instantly, and they burnt out very fast, and finally, dragonfly. All of these things were nerfed in Don't Starve Together, and survival has never been easier in the world of Don't Starve Together. It's still hard, but easier than its predecessor, which makes it more attractive to new players. But another part of that has to do with, you guessed it, the bosses and the progression system. People naturally like to have a goal, and it's the biggest shortcoming when talking about true survival sandbox games. Don't Starve is a somewhat unattractive game because of this. You have to make your own goals while struggling to survive against a hostile environment. But in Don't Starve Together, there's not only countless mini-bosses, but also full-fledged progression bosses for you to track down and take out. But don't get it twisted either. Don't Starve Together didn't leave its survival sandbox roots, because it's just as survival-y and sandboxy as ever if you want to get creative with it. I've proven this myself with 2 unique, non-boss related challenge runs, and I have many, many more planned. And while bosses do gatekeep most of the endgame to mid-game stuff, you aren't exactly punished for not going after them. Getting Dreadstone, Brightshade, or even Void Gear is amazing, and will make you feel very, very powerful, and be very powerful. You can still live just fine with a spear and a football helmet, and some extra work of course. When I really look back at it, I do sometimes say to myself that Don't Starve was better than Don't Starve Together, but then I remember I grew up playing Don't Starve, and only recently, in early 2024, started playing Don't Starve Together seriously. So, is it that old, uncompromising Don't Starve that I miss? Or do I just miss who I was as a person? It's probably the latter, let's be real. Don't Starve Together is a phenomenal game, and while I may not agree with every decision Clay has made for the game, like skill tree implementation and inflated health pools, I have to admit that I really do enjoy the game, even though I no longer feel endangered when hearing Deerclops come after me. Also, speaking of Deerclops, I have to give a massive shout out to these 2 right here because while everything around them changed, they pretty much stayed the exact same throughout all of the update lines. So, round of applause for them, I guess. Now, I'm curious how you guys feel about these changes. Yes, you, watching this video right now. Do you prefer bosses to be threats that you have to deal with? Or do you like the shift that Clay took all those years ago to make bosses more traditional and optional? Leave a comment down below, and while you're down there, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you aren't already. I'm sorry that this video was shorter than my average video. I just didn't want it to get too ranty or off topic, which I already feel like I did a lot in this video. I'll make up for it next Thursday, maybe. For now, you can watch this video right here, and this has been Polarlotus, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.